What's up, everybody? Jeff here. And I'm super excited because I have a special guest. I'm chatting with Brandon from Winged Hussar Publishing. How you doing?
Hey, nice to be here.
Awesome. So I guess we're going to talk about lots of book and wargaming novel things and stuff like that. But to start off, can you just give me a little bit of background about yourself and Winged Hussar and what you guys do?
Sure. So I am the main sci-fi and fantasy editor for Winged Hussar Publishing. We've been in business for about 11 years. Originally, we had a focus primarily on history, and that's still our main focus. But after a few years, we started branching into sci-fi and fantasy with an emphasis on wargaming novels. So novels that kind of help expand and tell the background of different games. So we work with Kings of War and Mantic games in general. And we most recently started working with Corvus Belli and Infinity. We've done a Blood and Plunder novel, and in the past, we've done Wild West Exodus and Gates of Antares novels before those games went into a different state. But my dad worked for Black Library for over 20 years, and then he took all that experience that he learned working with them. We made our own company, and then we've been working on it since then, and branching off into different genres, working with different authors, working with veteran authors, working with new authors, working with authors within the different games. I work closely with the community and try to take submissions from gamers to try to help them expand their gaming universe to help tie in with these novels. So it's a fun experience. It's a lot of work and it can be very difficult at times, but I really enjoy what I do and I enjoy getting to know the different communities and the people within the communities.
Very cool. Right up my alley for sure. So a publisher, I feel like that's a term that a lot of people are familiar with and have heard kind of bandied around, but I don't think a lot of people have a good understanding of exactly what the role of a publisher is or what you do. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that for us?
Sure. So there's a couple different aspects to it. So the publisher is the main body that actually like finalizes the work, contracts the work, finalizes it, and puts it to print. Um, some authors work with an agent to help them find a publisher that works with what they're trying to publish. We work directly with the authors. So, like I said, usually in the tabletop genre, I go out to the community and I look for people who are interested in writing, or vice versa. People come to me with submissions and they say, I have this idea. Would you be interested in working with me and publishing it? In the standalone sci-fi and fantasy and the history books, it's kind of more straightforward as we don't have an overarching presence to kind of dictate what we can write. So those are kind of more freeing and they're more general ideas. Meanwhile, the tabletop novels are kind of under an umbrella or a sandbox where we have to work with a gaming company to make sure that we stay within the realms of what is possible. So we don't want any lore breaking novels. We don't want to make any big decisions that would affect the course of the game without verifying that with the company that we're working with, first and foremost. Our job is kind of like, as a publishing company, there's different roles. So, like, I'm the editor. My father, Vince, is the head of the company. He handles sales and contracts and all of that sort of stuff. In different publishing companies, you might have somebody who does layout, you might have somebody who does covers, you might have somebody who specializes in just the contracts. So every company is different in where the roles that are within. But we start to finish are, the authors come to us, we look at the pitch, we approve it, or tell them that they need to rework it. Then the work comes to me. I have a pipeline of different novels that I'm working on, so it's always clogged with different things. So it goes into the very back of the pipeline unless there's a need for it to get rushed to the front. I edit it. We do back and forth, probably about 3 or 4 times, depending on the status of the author. If they've worked with us before, if they're familiar with the type of editing that we're looking for, and then we look for different. I look for different things such as continuity within the work, continuity within the greater series as a whole, grammar, the technical aspects of it. So I look at it as like a technical lens. I look at it as a audience lens. So if I'm looking at it brand new and I'm not familiar with the work, will it make sense to somebody just getting into it? And I look at it just as like a continuity in the whole. Does it make sense from start to finish? Do the names make sense? I look at it through couple different lenses just to make sure that everything makes sense and that we're having one whole complete work. After that, then it goes on to the layout stage where the book gets laid out and it gets in the style. Then it goes to the printer, and then it gets released both digitally and physically.
So you're sort of both facilitating the relationships between the writers and the IP holders, and also then like kind of taking what the authors are writing and putting all the finishing touches on it so that it can become a pretty book that we all get. Is that a fair way
Absolutely.
to summarize it?
Absolutely. And it kind of depends from company to company. Some of the companies like to directly interact with the authors and make sure that, everybody's getting on the same page. Other companies, some of the lore masters are busier than other companies, and they would rather me just be the go between and answer questions directly. So that way, they don't have the authors constantly hounding them.
Right.
So it's place by or company by company, but I'm usually the go between to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And usually, even in those situations where the authors have direct communications with the lore masters, I'm usually copied in on the email, so that way I'm on the same page as them as well.
So it sounds to me like that means that any universe that you work in, you have to sort of become an expert in the lore to make sure that there's no issues where, an author breaks continuity or says something that doesn't make sense. Is that right?
Absolutely. And my biggest challenge has been Infinity, just because there's so much background material.
Yeah.
So I kind of take it as a case by case basis. So as I start a novel, I look to see what the subject is, or if there's usually I can tell what is a specific thing I need to look at. So, the way somebody talks for the most part, I don't need to make sure that correlates necessarily to the background material. But there are certain things where they'll mention a city or they'll mention a weapon or a species, and I instantly pull up whatever background material I have, and between the wikis and the books and everything, and I just make sure that it lines up. If something seems like it's out of place, I'll just I'll make a flag for it. And a lot of times, if I'm not 100% sure if something is right or if I can't get a definitive answer, I'll then take that section and pass on to the lore master and say, what do you think of this? Is this okay? Should we tweak it? And we get the final approval of yes, that's fine. Even if it's like a lot of times there'll be new material or new information that the author will have created or something that's not explicitly stated within the background lore. I'll then take that section and send it to the lore master and think, is this okay? Like, this is something that would be new. Is this okay that we word it this way, or do you want us to just cut this out completely?
So is there one person at every company that is like the person in charge of the lore that you can go to and they're the expert to answer those questions?
For the most part, some companies have like sub lore masters or lore masters dedicated to certain factions, but usually there's one overarching person that's in charge of the way that the game is progressing and what is the technical detail. It's interesting because some lore masters are specific down to the minutia detail of this is how the world works, or this is what happens, or this person shouldn't talk like this. They're very specific, certain people.
Yeah.
And other ones are just like, yeah, that's vague enough. It falls into the umbrella. That's fine.
That's super interesting. I would love to be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations.
It's neat. It's a lot of fun. It's interesting. I'm very malleable, so in all the jobs I've worked in over the years, I mold to other people's styles. I kind of fall in step. Like, I can tell how somebody works, and I can match my working style to work alongside them. So with these different lore masters, I kind of learn how they operate, and then I tailor my emails and how I communicate with them to match their style.
Very cool. So from what you said, it sounds like you kind of mix and match. You have authors that you work with who you take pitches from, and then companies that you work with, their IPs that you start projects for. What does that process actually look like? Does Corvus Belly, for example, do they come to you and say, okay, we want to do a story about the nomads in the Infinity Universe? Can you find us an author? Does it work differently sometimes? Where do you ever work with like their specific writers, or is it always sort of you making those connections?
That's a really interesting question because, again, every company's different. So, like with Kings of War, that's our flagship fantasy IP. They have stories that they want to tell. So they say to us, I want to see a story about this. And so we find an author that's willing to work on that specific idea. They work with Mantic, and then we create a novel based on it. We did a novel based on their halfling faction, and it was called Broken Alliance. And that was pretty much crafted between the author, who's a veteran author of ours, Scott Washburn, and the main lore master at Mantic. And he basically said, okay, this is where I want to go. I want you to fill in as much of the details as you can. And so he created a lot of the background information they were looking for while telling the story that they wanted to tell. We have other novels like Mark Barber, who has done the first Infinity novel, Downfall. He did the first Kings of War novel for us, Steps to Deliverance. That was he came up with that whole idea. He came up with everything original. So we get a mix with them of novels that move the lore forward and the story forward, and we get a novel that are standalone that just tell a story in its own pages, and then you're done. With Infinity, we're not necessarily looking on moving the lore forward. We're not really at that stage yet. We kind of are just looking to tell stories within the Infinity universe and help flesh it out and help flesh out the characters. The relationship we have at Corvus Valley is we're fleshing the characters out more than we're fleshing the lore out. And I guess that goes hand in hand, because when you flesh the characters that are already existing and have miniatures and rules, you're already fleshing the lore out. I've asked their head lore master, are there stories you want to see? And he said, no, I'm interested in seeing what you guys can provide and interested in what the community provides. So the novels that we all have contracted with Infinity have all been just original ideas. Again, named characters are interesting because that also differs from company to company. The first foray we had into tabletop writing was with a game called Wild West Exodus, which has since gone through multiple revisions and ownership. That was a skirmish type game that was all named characters. So the stories that we were being asked to write were all about specific named characters in the game. There was no room for originality. When we switched gears and went to Beyond the Gates of Antares, which is also since now been more or less defunct, that they didn't necessarily have a lot of named characters. They said, no, strictly don't touch any named characters, make it all original. So we went from a game where we were supposed to focus on named characters to a game where no named characters, just all original stuff. So when we went to start working on Kings of War with Mantic, it was kind of like, what do we do? What are we doing here? So the first thing we did was we did a short story anthology that kind of touched on all the different factions, so people who weren't familiar with Kings of War knew what to expect, what the breadth of the world looked like. So from there, we kind of just were trying to gain traction and figure out what we were supposed to be, like where they wanted us to go. So we did stories with just original characters. Now the relationship's evolved where we're telling more stories with named characters and they're making appearances. Meanwhile, when we started working with Corvus Belli, they basically said, we want to see focus more on named characters than we do on original characters. There was kind of a assumption after Downfall. All of their works before then they had a novel release with, like the graphic novels and everything. They had a miniature release with it. So they tried the idea of releasing a miniature based off of a character in Downfall, which kind of worked almost in reverse because we created the character to more or less look like the miniature. So it was kind of like a mutual tie-in.
Right.
Originally, we were looking to find ways to release the miniature with the novel, but the way publishing works, it's not that easy, and you can't, like in a Barnes & Noble, for example, you can't exactly stock a miniature and a book. Barnes & Noble isn't going to be interested in carrying a miniature. So that's one way where the publishing world and the wargaming world are different.
Yeah.
So that, unfortunately, didn't work out. So there was kind of an expectation between fans and authors that every novel would have a miniature, and we kind of had to say, like, no, guys, this was just a one-time thing, a nice like little partnership we were able to do. So when Team Z released, people were like, "Oh, where are the characters?" And we're like, make it yourself. Those characters you can make based off of existing models. And I think on Reddit there was somebody who said they were going to make the team up, and I'm waiting for the picture still because I would showcase it once we get it. Same with Earhart. Earhart, that's the next novel that's going to release actually at Adepticon, and the author made made everybody in the book based off of his own miniatures. Like he had them all painted up already and everything. And he's shown me it since. And I was like, oh, cool. I can see where each of the characters are and where they're represented. So that was where that went with original characters. But moving forward, we're going to be seeing a little bit more of a focus on named characters. So it all depends. Every company is different on how they like things and what they want to see.
Interesting. So it sounds like the authors get a pretty fair amount of leeway, even when they do have like a specific assignment or like a kind of high level view of the story that the company wants them to tell. Do you get the sense that the authors have a preference between a more open ended, like kind of write whatever you want, and more of a specific assignment, or does it vary by the author?
I think it really varies by the author because so beyond also being the editor, we've also started a podcast called the WH Pubcast, and my co-host is Mark Barber, and we've talked about a couple different things in the writing world, and one of them we actually talk about is IP writing versus standalone writing or non-IP writing, and they're two completely different beasts because when you're writing in a game like this, you're tied to a sandbox, so you have a level of freedom, but I think anybody stepping into this world knows that these aren't their toys. Like they have to adhere to certain rules. And I think if you're getting into this, you go in with the assumption that you don't have full control and that you're basically going to be told that there are certain rules you have to follow, and there's certain areas that you have to stay away from. And I think that's part of the interesting thing in pitches is in the initial outline. When we get a pitch, we ask the author to give us a detailed outline. So then we look at it. If it's okay, we send it over to the lore master of that game, and then they pick out certain things that they're like, no, this we don't want to touch on. This is okay, but this we have to tweak. So we get a very early on sense of what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Well, yeah, I almost wonder if, I've read both of the Infinity novels, and I really enjoyed both of them. I almost wonder if not having to do the development of the sort of world in an original setting means that they can spend more time focusing on the characters. Both of those novels focused quite a bit on like a handful of important characters that were really well developed, and the background was there. It already exists in Infinity, of course, but and they gave plenty of that so that if you were new to it, you'd see it. But I almost wonder if being able to just focus on the characters is actually a benefit to them in some ways.
So that's a really difficult line we try to tread. With novels set in a war game, you kind of write it under the assumption that they're at least somewhat familiar with the background. Because if we were to spend every novel going into detail about the background, it would start becoming very repetitive. And you can't exactly say this is the book where to start, because it's an ever-growing timeline, ever-evolving series of novels. So what might be so people who start at Downfall, they might not start until Earhart releases. So do you define the background in every single book and have people continuously keep reading the same things and going, oh yeah, I already know that, and they just skim over that? So there's a level of, especially with today, with the internet and everything, we tell these novels that anybody can pick it up and read it. And we try to make the terminology and the background information kind of seamless, so that way you can read it and understand context clues. Me being brand new to Infinity, I can read these novels and understand for the most part what things mean. If there's something I have a question on, I absolutely Google it and I get the answer right away. So I think there's that level that you try to assume that the readers are going to be able to pick up on. It's like you said, it's easier that people don't have to focus on those things. I mean, with novels that aren't tied to an IP, you have to think about things like politics, religion, geography. How do all those things factor in? Because if you don't touch on them, it's a blank canvas in your world, and then people are left wondering on those aspects. But in an IP setting, you have those building blocks already in, so you can kind of tinker them in where you need to. But if somebody has a greater question on it, they can just Google it and find the answer, which is nice.
Yeah, that was actually why I really enjoyed reading Downfall in particular, because it was the first time that I think I'd read one of the comics before that, but I tend to prefer novels to comics. That's just a personal
Right.
quirk of my own. And when I read that, I had some familiarity with Infinity, but I hadn't really dug into the deep lore in the books and all that kind of stuff yet. And reading through that book, it was very easy to understand what was going on, even not having that expertise. But then it inspired me to go be like, okay, now I'm going to go read about the history between Pano and Yuching and get into all that stuff, because I had the basis of that story that was really intriguing to sort of kickstart me into all that. So it is interesting.
That's the goal, is finding that relationship between, so we work with the IP holder, but we're not working for them. We're not associated with them directly, but we're going to try to lure people in to say, look, if you enjoy, like, pick up this book and you can read it, and it's a good, solid book. But if you enjoy the world that you're reading about, there's a whole world out there of miniatures and graphic novels and everything. So that's the hook, is to try to lure them in and then expand on that interest.
Right, for sure. I was never super interested in the Nomads, and I read Team Z, and the Nomads are now my favorite faction, and they will always be
That's
my favorite
awesome.
faction, because reading that book, I was like, okay, now I get it. Now I understand the where they fit in and all this, and they're the best. So
That's awesome. Craig will be happy to hear that.
yeah. I like that book a lot. I did a video a while back. I think we've chatted about this off air, but I did a video about it, kind of summarizing the whole thing for folks who either haven't read it or aren't going to read it, because a lot of my audience are people that don't want to spend the time to go read through everything, but they want to know what happened. But hopefully I push all of them to actually go pick up the original work, because that's the goal anyway. But we'll see.
Well, that's also the tough thing with these IP novels, is that sometimes people are waiting for their faction. So they hold off on picking up a novel because it doesn't focus on the faction that they play, not realizing that, it's a tough line, because you try to tell them, well, if you don't support the novels as a whole, you're never going to get to see your faction, and I understand the desire, believe me, because I've been playing war games and video games, etc., since I've been young. So I totally understand that the desire to see their team, but you got to support the franchise as a whole if you want to see more in particular about what your specific interest is.
Well, and also it's important to see what the other factions are doing, even if they're not your favorite, because that relates to what your faction does, and also maybe they're your favorite faction and you just don't know it yet.
Exactly. Exactly.
So when you have either a pitch from the IP holder or you have an idea for a novel that you'd like to get going, how do you decide which author to sort of give those assignments to? Are there authors that particularly like to work in certain IPs, or do you go based on sort of the type of novels that they like to write, or how do those decisions get made? I imagine you guys are a big part of that process, right? Is kind of connecting those dots there.
It's interesting. Generally, when I have, especially on the bigger projects, I go to our veteran authors first, because I want to put, I don't necessarily want to put a newer author who hasn't fully grasped how these novels necessarily work on a big project and then have them not fully grasp the important things that they need to tell. I have put newer authors on some of those big projects, and it's not always worked out the best. There was actually two examples of a newer author I tried giving a bigger assignment to, and one flaked because he wanted an individual novel put out first, and then another one just couldn't, attempted to work on it, and then just it didn't work out. So I tend to like to put our veteran authors on the bigger projects. For example, um, Mark Barber wasn't supposed to lead. I think there was he's done novels in almost all the games that we've done, and he wasn't supposed to be the lead author for any of them. But it just happened that he was ready to go and had a book done that we're just like, okay, well, you're gonna be the first one to do it. So with Infinity, because he was our one of our veteran guys, and he was always our number one, we're putting the series out, you're gonna be the first book. I said and he was actually the one that pitched Infinity to me and said, have you asked the guys at Corvus Belly if they want to do novels? So I said to him, this was your original pitch, so why don't you lead off? And I was happy with how Downfall came out, and I was happy with that being the first book in the Infinity series. Like I mentioned before, with Scott Washburn doing our Halfling novel for Kings of War, he hadn't done any Kings of War novels. He did a short story about the Halflings in the anthology that we put out to start it, but he has his own series that's based off of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds called The Great Martian War, and that does really well as a standalone series. But I've always kind of wanted to get him slotted into the IP series because he is a long-term wargamer. So when that idea came up, I asked him if he was interested, and so he jumped on board with that. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis, like with everything, but I tend to, when we get a pitch from the IP holder that they want to see a specific book, I tend to default to our veteran authors and say, hey, what do you have going on? Especially if they're a veteran author that hasn't dipped their toes into the IP world yet. I like to try to get them involved in, so that way it expands their work of what they've done, and people can then go find their other projects.
So when you give someone an assignment, or you're getting a project going with an IP and they haven't worked in that IP before, what does the process look like for getting them on board for, whether it's Kings of War or Infinity or any of the other ones? I don't know if you need to play the game to really understand the universe, although I imagine it helps, but you certainly need to understand the sort of big picture of the lore as well as the nitty gritty of whatever you're writing about. So what does that process look like for them? Do they have a lot of homework to do before they can write?
It's interesting because yes and no. So we have authors that tell very different styles of novels. So, for example, when Mark gets into telling a new novel and a new IP, he plays the game from start to finish, paints up an army, learns everything about the game. The biggest compliment I could always give about Mark is he does his homework to the T.
He did a lot of military writing before this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, he's worked with Osprey, and he's done a lot. But some people don't. He does an approach where you can basically. Some people call it a battle report. because of how true to the game it reads, while not reading like two people are taking turns. People tend to say it's a battle report because they can see how the battle unfolds on the tabletop.
You mean
Some people
Downfall
absolutely love
specifically?
that. What was it?
You mean Downfall specifically?
Downfall, it falls in that style. I've seen some comments where people say it's a battle report. His Kings of War, Novel Steps to Deliverance, people have said it's a battle report, but the Kings of War audience and the Infinity audience look at a battle report in two different ways. Kings of War members, the gamers that we have that like that style, love it. They said that they really like being able to see the game being replicated in a novel because they play it and they like to see they like to mentally imagine how the two forces are playing out. Meanwhile, Infinity players were frowned on that, and they said, well, they don't necessarily like to see it being represented like a tabletop game because they can do that themselves. So it's two different styles of looking at it. We have other authors who, they do their research, they do their homework, but they pretend like the game doesn't exist, more or less. All of the rules, the how you play the game, that just is a whole nother area that they're not focusing on. They're focusing on the background and the factions, and they tell a story based off of that, completely excluding the rules. I've had certain authors say, oh, well, this unit has this trait in the rules, so I've implemented it in the writing. That's up to the audience to pick up on whether they see that or not. But I'd like to say every author kind of has their own unique style of how they do it, and the audiences all respond to it differently. It's the type of thing where you can't please everybody. So while some people's strengths are fantastic with some audiences, some people's strengths are miserable with other audiences, and the core of it is I look at the writing and I look at how well the author tells the story, and there are certain aspects that other people focus on that other authors don't. Certain authors will focus on the plot. Certain authors will focus on characters. Some authors will focus on expanding the background. And that's all each individual author style or each individual book is always different. So, yes, everybody does their homework. And I make sure that they have the tools applicable to do their homework. And that's part of my job, too, is I then have to... I'm like the teacher where I have to then check their work to make sure that they have done their homework. And I actually have had, I'll tell a fun little side story real quick, is there was a novel that we did that I really liked the author's style. But when I actually got to the draft of the novel, they basically ignored all of the lore for the universe. And I'm just like, okay, well, this doesn't make sense. There were so many issues that I was focusing on that I had another author look at it, and he found even bigger inconsistencies that are like, well, this unit doesn't actually look anything like this, and this unit would be able to destroy this unit, so this doesn't make any sense. So I then had to basically take the author off the project, and we redid it with me and a couple authors redid it, and we took the initial premise and made it stronger. So the initial core idea was still there because again, the guy had a solid writing style, but it's just he didn't adhere to any of the lore. So that it's evident, pretty obvious who does the research and who doesn't. And when I have to spend chunks of time telling people, no, this isn't right, usually that comes through in the outline, and usually I can catch that. But there are rare instances where the outline is sparse enough where I'm like, well, I'm assuming they know what they're talking about, that it comes down to the final project. It's like, no, the outline was sparse for a reason.
It's fascinating to me, and I asked that question because, as someone who likes to get very deep into specific IPs, universes, and really kind of understand them from all angles, it frustrates me when you see something like that, where there's something that's clearly just a blatant, they're just ignoring I'm staring down the barrel deciding whether I want to watch season 2 of the Halo TV show. And I'm a huge Halo fan. And the season 1 of that TV show was disappointing on a level that I can't describe, because they just completely undid so many of the interesting things that happen in the Halo universe. And I don't understand that mentality of like, why would you want to write in this universe if you don't care if you're just going to like undo the work or completely take a left turn from where, in some cases completely break, things that contradict existing canon. You're just going to make everyone mad, because everyone that is really invested in that universe is going to hate it. They're going to be like, well, why did I bother reading all these other books if you're just going to pretend that none of it happened,
Absolutely. So before I answer that question, I will say, if you didn't see already, Mantic is doing a Halo tabletop game.
Oh,
So
I'm day one, absolutely all in. I will absolutely. I mean, I still have my stuff from the original Halo game that Spartan did years
nice.
ago.
Yes.
I'll play anything Halo. You don't even have to. I don't care if it's not even a good game. I'll still play it.
They're a great company, and they really go all in on the lore, because they did the Hellboy and the Walking Dead games as well, and it was fantastic, great models and everything. But anyway, to answer your question, so one of the interesting things is how somebody interprets the lore, because somebody can do their research, but the way something is worded in the lore can be completely different. So there was a project that I was working on with a couple authors, and one of the authors and I interpreted the lore as one way, and two of the authors interpreted it as a completely different way. All four of us were reading the same information, but two of us had two completely different ways that we interpreted it. Now, mind you, the way I interpreted it, I asked the lore masters, and it was right. So it's interesting, and I could see exactly where their viewpoint was coming from, but I couldn't understand how they were getting to that point. But they both came to the same point, so there had to have been a reason why they came that way. So there are certain authors that do. There's occasionally times where the lore gets misinterpreted, and you even see this in communities when a novel comes out and people get all up in arms about a certain detail, and it's been verified by the lore masters of the game. People get it. We've talked about this on the podcast. Certain communities get wrapped up in their own headspace, and they get so focused on the fact that their group of friends believe this to be canon that they've made it canon without actually going back and re-looking at it through a different lens. So, like pronunciation, we did an audiobook for one of the Kings of War novels, and we're hoping to do an audiobook for the Earhart this year. We're hoping to look at doing an audiobook for that. But pronunciation, people get very, very, very bent out of shape on. The author pronounced one of the factions the way that he was told to pronounce it. I'm pretty sure it was vetted by the lore masters, and a couple of people in the community got all up in arms because they're like, "That's not the way we pronounce it. That's not the way it's been pronounced for years." It's like, well, dialects. I mean, there's a million reasons why it might not have been pronounced the way that you think it's supposed to be pronounced, or that it might very well be pronounced. But that's not a deal breaker. It's not the end of the world if other people had different headcanons or different things just because you assume certain things. So I think that goes into certain authors' mentalities, and that might even go into like novel to television, novel to movies, is that they take things in a certain way and then they just run with it because one idea spawned a certain way that they perceive it. So they perceive it as that being the core without looking at all the other details around it to say, no, that's wrong because all these other things exist. So it's interesting seeing an author's mentality, and I even question it on certain authors. I'll say, like, how did you come to this, or why are you doing it this way? And they'll say, well, this happened. So I 100% understand that, and I 100% can say that sometimes there's just wrong is wrong, but there's a way it's all about how they got to that point, I think.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate different interpretations, and I think that's a good story you should be able to interpret it in different ways depending on what you're the person you are and how you're coming at the story. But I think when people are rejecting already established canon that are facts, that's where it becomes a much bigger issue. But I guess that's why we need people like you in the middle that can kind of mediate and say, okay, well, this we've confirmed this is how it's said, or this is what happened in the past, so we're going to go this way, not the way that you decided.
Absolutely. And sometimes there's retcons that happen that we do everything to cover our bases on, but sometimes things slip through. In our Kings of War short story anthology, they have a faction in that game called the Trident Realm, and they're like fish people. Their main core unit are naiads, and historically, naiads, for the most part, depending on how you look at it, are females. But the models were ambiguous, and myself and the author that wrote the short story, and actually another author who wrote a novel after that about that faction, assumed there were male naiads because it had never been said there wasn't. So in the anthology, we have a male naiad in the story. And it wasn't until we got to a novel that focused after that the Mantic said, no, naiads are just females. We're like,
Whoops.
short story got passed by you guys, and you didn't catch that. We didn't assume. We assumed it was fine. So it was like an inconsistent. We had to retcon, but like it's the most minute thing that a handful of people might catch and then question, and then we'll say it made it by the wayside. It's just it happens in anything and everything. There's always things that you, I always tell authors, I'm like, you can try your best between me and them to catch every single little mistake or inconsistency. But there are things that no matter how many times you look at, you'll start creating new inconsistency and you'll start catching new things that you didn't realize. And there has to be a point where you just say, I'm done. I've looked at this with as thorough lens as I can. And if there's something that made it to print, we looked at it 5 or 6 times. There's only so much we can do.
Yeah, it's got to be a really tough job between you and whoever the lore master is on any given project, because especially an IP like Infinity, or like I do a lot of stuff on Malifaux, and very similar.
Right.
Like there's years and years and years and years of rule books that all have lore in them, and then you have RPG reference books, and then you have comics, and then you all these different places that the lore is coming from, and you may not have all that stuff easily, right on the top of your mind when you're reviewing something, but you put it out into the public and 10,000 people read it, and 10 of them are going to be like, nope, this contradicts something from this obscure lore place that I read recently, and they're gonna know it right away, and you could read it 10 times and never notice.
The tough thing also is I think people tend to forget that we are human. And especially us in particular, we're a small company. So when you have such a big company like Corvus Belli that puts out so much product and so much like background information, you get people who there's a lot of people that actually don't understand that we're not directly associated with them, and they're not putting out the novels, and we are. And I've had to go on record a couple times and say, like, hey, we're not Corvus Belli, and there are certain things that we can't do that they can do, and vice versa. And I think that some of the things that people in general just find to nitpick on do not represent the whole. I think people in general will just always find things to, like myself, for example, before I became invested in all this. If I read a book and I found a typo or something, I was like, how did they miss it? It's right there. And it's a big typo. I found it even. And again, you can look at it 7,000 times, but if your eyes are not specifically looking for that particular thing, and there's that old rule of if you see the first letter of the word and the last letter of the word, sometimes your brain is just tricked to believe it's that word without actually looking at the letters in between.
It doesn't matter what order
it happens. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've had things go out on videos that I said that were either untrue or that editing mistakes and stuff like that. And it's like I edited this whole thing for hours, and then I reviewed it, and then I published it, and it just went right under the radar. Just totally had no idea. It happened.
Right. But that said, you still put out a quality channel, and I've watched a good handful of your videos, and they're all great. Everyone that I've seen.
Sometimes I got to take them down and fix them, but we get through it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Why do you think? I mean, you mentioned before that, and obviously, Winged Hussar does a bunch of non-wargame related stuff, but why focus on wargames in particular?
It's an interesting thing. We've talked about this on the podcast about how there are strengths and weaknesses with both formats. The biggest strength that from a wargaming standpoint, is you have a built-in fan base. You have people who, for the most part, are looking for more lore to expand on the universe. And the tough thing about the gaming companies is that they don't necessarily have, a lot of them don't necessarily have the manpower to devote to that process. So kind of what my dad learned from, working for Black Library is they had a company that was devoted to both sides. They had Game Workshop and Black Library. So they have two halves of a whole that does the whole thing. Most other companies would love to get into that scene of writing novels that expand on the world, but they don't have the manpower to do it. They don't have the accessibility to make a whole second company to just deal with novels, because it's a gamble. I mean, for example, Kings of War, we have a handful of people that are diehard fans, and they're amazing. We love them. But the majority of the community doesn't care about lore, and they don't care about the novels, because all they want is a good rule system, and that's what they see in Kings of War. So we try to find that way to balance. How do we attract more of the fan base of people who play the game? But it's tough when you want to just specifically play for the game itself, which I don't blame them for. So it's when you have a standalone novel or something that's not tied into an IP, you have to build that audience yourself. You have to build the author instead of building the community. So some authors look at it as they can write a novel and publish it, promote within an IP, but then take that knowledge they've learned and then go and make a standalone novel because they've now created people interested in their works, and then they can take that interest and build it out into their own way, where they can then do their own thing without having to be tied down to a game master. We like wargaming first and foremost, and we have a lot of ties within the wargaming community, so we like to work with them and help them. We do what we do, they do what they do, and we can both work together to create a product that expands their world and tells stories that they don't have the time or capabilities to do within their rule books. Meanwhile, we help expand their game, and people get interested in what we do. So, like for example, with Mark's stuff, we've had some of the Downfall fans jump into his Kings of War books because they really enjoyed Downfall, and vice versa. We've had Kings of War players who've never heard of Infinity, which I find it hard, but yes, people have not. I was one of them. I had never heard of Infinity before because I mostly wasn't looking, but still, we've had people who went from Kings of War to then check out Downfall because they like his writing. So it's a symbiotic relationship of everybody works together. The wargaming community is such a niche thing in general that you want to try to build those bonds and strengthen those ties between gamers to make them understand that there are good people and good companies and good authors, and we all have this great relationship working together. That's really neat to see.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I was going to ask. I've had some conversations with other folks who do gameplay focused YouTube channels that I work with occasionally, and the topic often comes up of like, what's the breakdown between people who play the game and people who care about the lore at all? And I'm curious what your perspective on that is, of like what, Infinity is obviously one of the bigger war games out there, and it seems like there's a pretty dedicated fan base that does care about the lore, at least to an extent. But most people who play the game just play the game, and only sort of a subset of those people care about the lore, whereas it doesn't really. I mean, I actually do know a couple people who care about Malifaux lore, for example, that don't play Malifaux, but that's a very, very small. There's like 3 of them that I know. So from your perspective, how do you think that breaks down? What percentage of the game's player base cares enough about the lore to buy either a rulebook or a novel to read more about it?
I think it's case by case basis. With the game companies that we work with, Mantic and Corvus Belli's games are very different in their fan base of what they want to see and how they experience the games. Kings of War for a long time was a refugee for players who played Fantasy Warhammer when Fantasy Warhammer went away. So Kings of War was kind of like, you want a good rule set? Here you go. Use your own minis. Mantic for a long time wasn't necessarily focused on Mantic minis. Now they've since stepped forward and they're like, look at all these factions that we have miniatures out for. Like we can promote the fantasy better than some of the other companies can. But so that's why you see a majority of their fan base specifically just for the rules. I've literally been involved in conversations on their Fanatics Facebook page where people say, I literally could not care less about the lore. I don't focus on it. I want less lore. I'm like, that's your prerogative. It's your money invested in the game. You do with what you want. Meanwhile, Corvus Belli and Infinity, the fans are just ravenous for lore. They love the lore, and I see it. People debate on the most minute details, like the big joke that Mark and I have is smoke grenades from Downfall. There were people who just really did not like the fact that Pano used smoke grenades, and from Mark's experience of what he's done and he knows, and from what I know of just science fiction in general, I didn't think, and because other factions do have smoke grenades, I didn't think it was too far-fetched to just assume that they could potentially have smoke grenades. But a lot of people got really offended about the fact that there were smoke grenades in Downfall. So our running joke is Mark apologizes frequently for the use of smoke grenades in Downfall. So I want to say Kings of War is probably 75-25 for rules versus lore. And I want to say I don't know the Infinity community as well, but I'm probably going to say it's 60-40 of lore to rules. I'll say the Infinity community is definitely more invested in the lore than some of the other communities we work with.
This is a bit of a tangent here, but I'm really curious about this. Does Mark take it as a compliment when somebody reads his book and the thing that they're upset about is the smoke grenades? And it's like, I read this whole book, it's a couple hundred pages. They obviously enjoyed it enough to keep reading it, right? And they're so passionate about it that they're like, I need to go on the internet and complain about this one tiny little thing. Because they could be complaining about, they could be like, oh, you're such a, they could come up with something that is way worse than that. But they're like, I'm gonna find this the nitpick. That's the only complaint I have. I feel like that's a positive thing.
I think it is.
Yeah.
But Mark he puts heart and soul into everything he does. Like he devotes so much time into learning the game inside and out, to developing the characters, to developing the plot. He puts everything into his writing, and it's one of the things I respect the most about him. So he takes critique well, because there was a while where there was when Downfall first came out, there was a meme about Kyle being radical, and the association of the meme of Kyle with the Monster Energy drink and everything. And so there was pictures floating around of the Kyle Hawkins mini with a monster, and like he was radical. And so Mark was obsessed with that and thought it was a great form of flattery that people would turn Hawkins into a meme. But then there were some more outspoken, just for lack of a better term, rude criticism that wasn't even criticism, that was just name calling, that kind of daunted him from interacting with the community anymore. Which, on the internet, I've said to him, I've said to other people, you can't read the reviews because anybody can put anything out, and it doesn't mean there's validity behind it.
Yeah.
Criticism is understandable in any form, but when people take that to the next level and they start name calling and insulting without fully understanding just how much work goes into this situation and these novels, and the writing process and the editing process, and how much investment from both the publisher and the author that gets put into these, it becomes discouraging. So I think, yes, he does understand that it is a form of flattery that somebody would read the whole entire novel and their one complaint is smoke grenades. I think he was baffled about why the smoke grenades in particular. Like, out of all the things, why smoke grenades? So that's why I think it's an ongoing joke with us. But I think as a general thing, I think people in general should try to understand, if you don't have something nice to say, consider what you're going to say. Criticism is fine. If you don't like something, that's fine. It's fine to give valid criticism about, like, this could have been done better. I didn't care for the way the author did this. But I think the internet's kind of made this faceless anonymity where people can just think they can say whatever they want to say without any repercussions. So it's a tough line to straddle. Yes, I think he does understand the humor behind it, but at the same time, it's also some of the more negative aspects have caused him to stray away from just interacting with the community in general. And so I kind of become the barrier of trying to interact with people when they have questions about the novels.
I think there's also an element of it where, like with a lot of things, just as humans, we are more likely to go complain about something we didn't like than to go praise something that we did like. So,
absolutely,
1,000 people read your novel or watch your video or whatever it is that you're putting out, and 999 of them liked it, and one of them doesn't, but they're the only one that comments. Yep. So then that's the only perception. Your perception is that it's super negative, but it's that everybody else just liked it and didn't say anything.
I don't necessarily like to get involved when I see people. Like, people can, again, people are entitled to their opinion, but when people are blatantly wrong about things, and I see the conversation happening, like, on social media, I tend to jump in and just remind people, like, hey, I work for the publishing company, this, that, and the other thing. And the conversation seems to stop, I think, because people realize
that you're human.
Oh, yeah, that there is an actual person that's associated with this. I've had to do that before, I think 2 or 3 times in the Infinity Facebook group. And it happened once at the very beginning of our Kings of War foray, but has not happened since.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned before that one of the criticisms of Downfall specifically was that the fight scenes felt too much like the game. And
Yeah.
I've read a little bit of historical nonfiction that's like war stories about particularly World War II. And
Mm.
to me, that's what it felt like. It didn't feel like playing Infinity at all to me. To me, it felt because Infinity has a lot of like, and I guess there was a little bit of this in Downfall, so I shouldn't say go too far with it. But in Infinity, there's a lot of like, here's a couple of really important characters that are going to go run through your opponent's army and vice versa.
Mhm.
That most of the battles in Downfall felt more like larger scale engagements to me than a game of Infinity, and it read more like a World War II story. And I remember one of the big things when the book first came out, and I think my channel was up, but I had never done anything with Infinity yet. One of the complaints that I kept seeing people make was that the characters referred to their weapons by their in-universe names and not just as my gun or my rifle. And I was like, that's such a strange criticism because if you go read like Band of Brothers, I had just recently read at the time, and I was like, none of the vets in that story refer to their gun as my rifle. Almost
Right.
across the board, they refer to their gun by the name of the gun. They call it my M1 or my Thompson or whatever. And I was like,
Right.
so why is I don't understand why that would be a criticism of a story about someone who obviously has this, they're in the military, this is their, they have this relationship with their weapon. And even if that wasn't realistic, it seems like a strange complaint to me, but I guess everybody's got a different, you know.
And that was something requested specifically of Corvus Belli. I think Mark had come up with a replacement word for it so that way it wouldn't be so repetitive, but they specifically wanted that used. So that's one of those things that's out of our hands, and that was specifically directed on us, so we can't go against what was asked of us. It's a fair thing, and we both agreed. We saw that in the early drafts, but we have to adhere to rules too. So um, it's interesting. I think maybe people think that it could have been worded differently, where it didn't need the focus of that in the subject, and like reword the paragraph so that way that's not the focus and something else was the focus. But there are times, like if you're in the heat of battle, describing how you're fighting and what you're doing. I mean, I don't know. I felt like the way it was described, the way it was written was natural, but I think maybe from an outside eye, seeing that repeated so much was something that caused them concern. But again, criticism is valid. We listen to criticism and we take it in stride. But there are certain things that, like that, I have to say, that's out of our hands.
I haven't read any of the 40K novels, but I want to go check out some of the 40K novels and see if they call it my bolter and not my gun, because I bet they call it a bolter every time.
I When my dad worked for Black Library, we had a lot of authors over for like games days and stuff. So it was cool getting to know a lot of them. So like I've had when I was younger, like still in high school, like Mike Lee, Dan Abnett, CL Werner, those guys, we interacted with them like once a year. And Dan Abnett like stayed at my parents' house and everything. And it was a cool experience. And going on a road trip from New Jersey to Baltimore with some of those authors like Dan it was a fantastic experience. And despite all that, I didn't read any of the 40K books except for Gaunt's Ghosts, because I wasn't, believe it or not, as passionate as I am about editing and writing now. I could not have cared less when I was in high school. I spark notes all of my books for AP English because I was just like, nah, I don't want to read Crime and Punishment. Not interesting. College was another story. I read all the books there, but high school was just, I had no interest in it. So Gaunt's Ghost was the only series I read, and I really enjoyed it. And I've told Mark, I see a lot of parallels in the way that those books were written and his own writing. Certain things I see that Dan did that I can see in Mark's writing. And, everybody's welcome to their own opinion, but that's how I look at it, having read those books.
Do you think there are certain aspects of wargaming universes that are the most interesting to explore in novels, or even like specific genres of novels that you think work the best for wargame fiction?
I think, I like to say the unexpected, but that's almost trite now to say expect the unexpected. But I like novels that don't necessarily follow the same path as there are two factions at war. We're going to tell the story about what's going on while the two factions are fighting. It's kind of hard to do, especially when most of the time, your game is involving you against another player. So, the stories mostly revolve around that. But we did a novel for Mantic called Pride of a King that focuses more, it's a dwarf novel that focuses more on the political intrigue and mystery going on with that. And it was interesting to see the dwarves in that light, mostly because most fantasy dwarves you think of Gimli, and this is anything but that. I'm a huge Dragon Age fan. I have a Dragon Age poster on my wall here. Um, so when we were pitching the idea, I said to the author, I'm like, I would really love to see the dwarves something like how they were in Dragon Age Origins, because I found that to be the most compelling fantasy dwarves I've ever experienced. I love the political civil war between them. So he used that, he lifted some influence of that and put that in the novel. And I think the political intrigue between the two dwarf factions was like a really cool thing that you don't see in most wargaming. That you don't see it in a lot of wargaming novels. Another one, Earhart, that's coming out soon. It's interesting because it tells the story kind of what happens when unit of one faction gets put in the middle of unit of another faction. And in the real world, like if you belong in one country and then you go to another country, and then it's not necessarily, you're not beholden to where you are from. That can change. Like your allegiance can change when you move somewhere. So, but in wargaming, you have those set characters that belong to those set factions, those set units that, you can't say, oh, I'm going to take my Hakislam army and I'm going to convert some of them into Pano. The game doesn't really work like that. In fantasy, you can't take an orc and then say, well, he's now part of the human army. It doesn't work like that. But with fiction, we have that opportunity to explore what happens if you take a person of one unit and you move them into another faction, because you don't necessarily have to apply to laws of points and army schemes and things like that. You can kind of tell a story about how that person exists within another faction. And I think that's another really interesting thing you don't see too much, because so many people are focused on this is this faction, this is this faction. They don't really blend too well. One of the things I've been toying around with an idea, and I just like to see it in general, of when you take a evil faction and you turn them more into the character into more of an anti-hero than straight evil. That's the most compelling story for me. I love anti-heroes. And when you take that bad person and you make it so they're relatable in some way and that they work with the hero and you love to see them working with the hero, I think that's one of the coolest and most compelling stories. I'm a huge Venom fan. So, I love the stories where Venom works with Spider-Man and he's a good character. Wolverine, another more or less anti-hero. He kind of breaks the rules. And he's badass in what he does. So I like seeing stories like that where the villain is not necessarily too evil, but there is gray within his character where you can see him working with the good guys.
Yeah, we were actually literally this morning having a conversation on my Discord with I was talking to a couple different people about what makes a good villain, and the fact that a villain that has understandable motivations, even if you disagree with what they're doing, you should understand why they're doing it. And if they're just evil for evil's sake, that's not as interesting as if it's somebody who you could see, there is that gray area where you could see them kind of cooperating with other people.
Exactly. Mark's first Kings of War novel, Steps to Deliverance, some of the highest praise we got was because of his villain being very relatable, and how he fell to villain status because he was a former like glorified hero that just made the wrong decision and slowly took him down this path of evil. His antagonist got really high praise because of that, and that's another reason why that was a strong leadoff novel for us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Kings of War has been on my short list. I think there's probably like 3 other IPs that I want to really jump into, and Kings of War is on that list. So I'm looking forward to checking that out for sure.
Absolutely. When you dip your toes in there, let me know. I can absolutely send you some novels.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited about that. There's a bunch of Kings of War ones, right? I think there's at least 4 or 5 I've seen, right?
We're probably up to about 10 right
Oh wow.
now.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, there's one, two. Give me 2 seconds. 1, 2, 3. There's about 10. I
There's a
can
bunch.
say that.
Yeah,
There's about
I'll put
10, and there's
links
about
so
10
people
more
can check them
scheduled.
out.
Absolutely. You go to our Winged Hussar Publishing store. You can see all of them and some of the upcoming ones
There
too.
you go. Perfect. Before I let you go, is there any other IP or potentially any other author that you're aware of that you would like to work with in the future that you haven't yet?
So one of the best things that we've had from my dad's experience working with Black Library is we've been able to bring some of those authors over. So like Clint Werner has worked with us and done a couple novels. We're doing a horror anthology that's going to be releasing, I think, around the time of Adepticon with Graham McNeil. So it's cool having him publish a story under us. I honestly, it's my dream to be able to get Dan Abnett to write something for us, which I'm sure I could talk him into it, but his price point is just still a little too high for us. So, in the future, I would love to get him on board to do a novel. So, at some point, that's my dream. As far as other games, I would actually like to dip my toe into Malifaux, believe it or not, and I think we've reached out to them at some point to look at potentially doing that. But I think either they weren't interested or they said they'd get back to us. So that's something that, hey, listen, if they ever want to do novels, they know where to find us.
I have mentioned it to them, and I will continue to mention it to them because the day that there's a Malifaux novel will be spectacular. It will be like my birthday.
There you go.
I'm very excited for that. It's a universe that I think would work very well for it because all of their fiction is in narrative form. Well, not all of it, but the vast majority of it is in narrative form anyway.
Right.
Although I do know they work pretty closely with some of the authors that they work with, so I don't know if that would be a barrier, but I'm sure there's ways to figure that out.
Exactly.
All right, so what do you have? What do you have coming up that you can tell us about? Any exciting plans for the future? I know Earhart's coming soon. I'm super excited for that.
So we're really looking forward to Adepticon this year. I'm not sure when this video is going to drop, but Adepticon is the end of March, and we took a year off last year because COVID still has wreaked havoc on everything in as far as timing and what happens when. And the year before that was a very bizarre year at Adepticon for us. So we took a year off to kind of just pump up the catalog a little bit. And it's also, we're traveling from New Jersey, so it's a 13-hour car ride with all of our books and everything. So we focused locally a little bit. So we're going back this year, and we're going back with a bang because we've got a lot of posters and signage we're going to be bringing about like novel covers and everything. We're going to be doing a seminar this year. If you are going to the Corvus Belli seminar, we will be talking there for 5 minutes as well. Our seminar for ourselves has sold out, which is great because for our first year, we didn't know what to expect, and it sold out. So we're happy about that. We've got a couple people on the wait list. We're trying to expand that, so we're hoping we can. We're going to be bringing... We've since purchased an interest in a retail store called On Military Matters, which does new, used, and out-of-print books focused mostly on military history. But they're also one of the biggest publishers and producers of their own individual rules and scenarios in the United States. So we've got a slew of different rules and stuff that we're going to be bringing with us to Adepticon. We are going to be releasing a few books just in time for Adepticon. For example, Earhart it was supposed to be released in January, but because of printer delays, it got pushed to March, which is great because it comes out just a few days before Adepticon, so we will be having plenty of copies with us there. So we have another standalone science fiction novel that's going to be coming out called The Sword and the Cipher, and we're really excited about that because the cover art is done by Tommaso Dall'Osto. I hope I didn't butcher his last name, but he's really big in the Infinity community, and he does a lot of fan art. We've really been trying to showcase his ability because he's fantastic. He did a cover art for my standalone novel. It's going to be re-releasing this summer. He did the cover for this novel that's going to be releasing. He's done the inside artwork for several of Mark's books. The Downfall, he did the inside black and white for that. He did a black and white art for Earhart. So look forward to that. And I think the horror anthology Dominion, something on Dominion Street, is going to be releasing for Adepticon as well, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So we're just really looking forward to Adepticon and having that out. In the pipeline, I'm currently working on our latest Kings of War novel called Honor's Price. And I have some Infinity novels in the pipeline that are just in various stages of production. So there should be at least 2 more Infinity novels coming out this year. Mark Barber is doing a sequel. Craig Gallant's doing a sequel. So just expect some more Infinity, because that's going to keep coming. And we're always churning out books. My pipeline is just huge of all these novels that are in various stages that I'm working on. So lots of stuff.
Hopefully, the COVID situation is a little more forgiving, and because I'm certainly looking forward to all those. Where can folks keep up with you and keep in touch if they want to know more?
Absolutely. So if you ever have any questions about writing, about the publishing industry, even if you just want to talk wargaming, you can find me on social media. I'm most active on Facebook, Brandon Rospond. I'll give you my email if you can put that in the description as well, so people can contact me directly. They can visit our website at whpsupplyroom.com. That has all of our products. You can find us at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, everywhere. And if you like podcasts, Mark Barber and I host the WH Pubcast. So I'm all over the place.
Awesome. I will link all of that stuff in the description below. Thank you so much for coming on. This was great.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Huge thank you to the extremely cool kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, Devin, and Spilled Paint Pot. And thanks for watching.